Those of you that have been around on this channel for a while know that I wasn't a big fan of Resistance 1 and 2. And of course, if you don't like someone's beloved exclusive, it must not be that the game just isn't subjectively as good as they think it is, you must have some ulterior motive. I got a decent amount of comments that said things along the lines of, "This game is great, you're just an Xbox fanboy." To that I have two things to say. One, it takes very little time to look through my channel and see that I'm a PC gamer, and two, how can I be an Xbox fanboy when I use the PlayStation 1 boot up sound as my intro? Well, this video has been a long time coming. I made a video on Resistance 2 a good 5 months ago and said I'd do Resistance 3 soon, only now getting around to it. But hey, I'm getting to it now, and thankfully, unlike Resistance 1 and 2, I actually really liked this game. Keep in mind, my problems with Resistance 1 wasn't that it was uncreative. It had a lot of potential, I just didn't like a lot of the choices they made. For example, in Resistance 1, all the enemies had a lot of health, and this isn't a problem if the enemies flinch appropriately if you do damage to them, but that didn't happen. Instead, you would be shooting them and they'd just shoot you right back through your own bullets, making it feel like they had more health than the player, which is never acceptable. The whole overall vibe I got from Resistance 1 was just that it was a very frustrating, tedious game, not an enjoyable one. It was also very gray and brown and just dragged on and on. In general, I didn't have much fun with it. But it still had an incredibly interesting world surrounding it. I didn't have problems with the creativity in the game, just, again, some bad choices that made the overall game itself not so fun to me. Resistance 3, on the other hand, doesn't fall into any of these problems Resistance 1 had, or Resistance 2. The story follows where Resistance 2 ends, but you're not playing as Nathan Hale, spoilers here, you play as Joseph Capelli. Joseph is the person responsible for shooting and killing Nathan Hale at the end of Resistance 2. So the main characters have been swapped, but it's a unique twist. The game is a lot more bleak than the other two games. The world was slowly being taken over in Resistance 1 and 2, yes, but Resistance 3 is the full fallout. The Chimera have really taken everything over, and there's only small pockets of humans remaining. The end result is a lot more focused of a story, focusing on Joseph Capelli, his story, and just small survival groups trying to stay alive. In Resistance 1 and 2, the main focus was the entire army and more or less the whole world, so you never quite got these direct stories. The end result is that the plot is told much better in Resistance 3 than it was in Resistance 1 or 2, but as a whole the plot isn't actually that great. I can sum up this plot very quickly for you. At the beginning of the game, you run into Malikov, the scientist in the previous games, who explains to Joseph that the Chimera have opened up a wormhole in the middle of New York. The intent of this wormhole seems to be freezing the planet to make it uninhabitable for humanity, and you need to go close the wormhole. At the end of the game, you succeed in doing this, but that's pretty much it. There's not really anything else to add to it. So the overall branching story isn't as interesting as the first two games, but the actual adventure, getting from point A to point B, is more interesting. There's even a point in this game, for the first time in the entire franchise, that you have to fight other humans. Keep in mind the world is effectively over, so of course you're going to run into things like bandits. The story is rather an anticlimax after the first Resistance 1 and 2 games, but I don't know, I find it more appealing. At the very least, it makes for a much more atmospheric game, and I noticed this right at the beginning of the game. Right after the opening cutscene, you're thrown into this underground area, this community of surviving humans trying to just stay alive. It reminds me a lot of, say, the original Metro 2033, just not as good because, well, no one's really that good. You're allowed to just kind of walk around, see conversations, and just get the general vibe of the place. And this stays true throughout the entire game. It's something that you didn't have in the other Resistance games. The other games never made it feel like I wasn't playing a video game. In Resistance 1 and 2, it almost feels like the levels sort of drag on, without a whole lot of narrative push. Just have some enemies, shoot them, survive, keep going. But in Resistance 3, you're frequently thrown into scripted events. Things that aren't so scripted that it feels like you're in an interactive cutscene, and the best comparison I can make to this is Half-Life 2. In fact, I drew that comparison a lot as I was streaming the game. I know a lot of other people have, looking at it later, but keep in mind I didn't look at any reviews before playing this game, never played it myself. I was coming into this completely blind, and I noticed the Half-Life 2 inspiration immediately. Now when I say inspiration, I just mean inspiration. They didn't rip Half-Life 2 off. Even if one point in the game feels like it's almost entirely taken from Half-Life 2. You're in an old, worn-down mining town with enemies that are almost zombie-like, and a preacher is following you around. Now, where have I seen that before? Okay, so the inspiration can be rather in your face, but the gameplay doesn't feel directly like Half-Life 2, and I'd rather have them be inspired by Half-Life 2 than do what they did in Resistance 1 and 2. Speaking of that, what did they change? Well, surprisingly, a good amount. Thankfully, they brought back the weapon dial. Instead of only carrying a few guns, you can now have all of them at once. Why they got rid of this in Resistance 2 after the first game, I'm not sure. One of Resistance's strongest aspects were the unique, interesting weapons. So why limit them? Well, in this game, carry as many as you want. Have fun, go at it. Thank God. And even better, the weapons have upgrades to them. Upgrades that don't require you to do specific crazy things or find them in the environment. You just kill with the weapon you want to upgrade, and then it's worth it. I mean, it's really worth it. These upgrades are insanely good. For example, the shotgun suddenly gets incendiary rounds, which lights enemies on fire, and oh my goodness, it makes it so fun. Or the mutator gun, which will mutate and turn people into a green blobby mess, but instead, once you upgrade it, they still turn into a green blobby mess, but they also turn into suicide bombers that attack your other enemies. I mean it when I say these upgrades are worth going for. And you don't have to do anything other than just playing the game and using the guns that you like the most. This adds a huge amount of replay value to the game, because by the end of the game, you likely will not have all your guns upgraded. Probably just the ones you use the most. So the next time you play through the game, it encourages you to experiment with your other weapons. And really, none of these weapons aren't useful. You can use any of them. Every weapon in the game has a useful split function, and the entire weapon roster is just interesting. We don't see guns like this in shooters anymore, and I really wish we did. The whole game feels like this weird sort of blend of early 2000 shooters to late 2000 shooters. It feels like Half-Life, but it also has some of the shooting mechanics of, say, Call of Duty. This is a good thing, keep in mind, because one of the things I complained about in the first two games was just that the shooting didn't feel all that great. The guns in Resistance 3 have recoil now, or at least they feel like they do. They're not overwhelming and you won't be shooting the ceiling, you can still kind of spray with them, but every shot does have some sort of visual kickback, and it just feels more like you're shooting an actual gun. Even if you're using the alien weapons that don't fire actual bullets, it still feels like you're firing a powerful weapon. This feel of shooting an actual weapon was sort of not there in the first two games. And the enemies react appropriately. When you blast someone up close with a shotgun, they go flying. It's fun. Speaking of enemies, they do seem to have a little bit more health than they did in Resistance 2. Resistance 2 solved the bullet sponge problem by making enemies have little health, but then they also just kind of randomly killed you at times, leading to an even more frustrating game than the first one. Resistance 3 gave the enemies their health back, but instead made them properly flinch, so they weren't just bullet sponges that shot back through your own bullets, and this problem is entirely fixed. In fact, the whole game feeling frustrating is kind of gone. Every once in a while, my Twitch chat would tell me, here comes another annoying enemy, but I never really had a problem. Even the enemies that seem annoying are not very difficult to deal with. For example, there are these drones that will give enemies shields, and all you gotta do is shoot the drones a few times, they explode, then you shoot the enemies. It's not really that big of a deal. In fact, I found the engineers in ODST to be more annoying. It just feels like Resistance 3 is a more refined experience, as if they playtested it more to reduce those frustrating situations where it felt like it wasn't your fault that you died. Or to reduce situations feeling like enemies pouring out of clown closets that you can't ever get through, but you're going to have to, and you don't know where the enemies stop coming from. This is stuff that really made me not like the first two games. But again, I didn't have any experiences like this in Resistance 3. In fact, the only times I got somewhat annoyed is when they kind of started spamming some small bug enemies, because no one likes fast, small enemies that are difficult to hit. But it wasn't really that bad. At this point, you're probably asking if the game is too easy, but no, it didn't feel like it was too easy to me, it just didn't feel like it was overly tedious. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely easier than the other two games, but I never really got the impression that the other two games were difficult, just that they were unfair to the player. When I died in Resistance 3, it felt like it was actually my fault. And the last thing I have to talk about is that this game looks quite a bit better than the other two games. Like, for a PS3 game, it still looks pretty good to this day. With that said, it does come with all the shortcomings of a PS3 game. The resolution is rather low, the FOV is rather tight, and the frame rate is kind of all over the place. It's supposed to stay at 30 FPS, but it really doesn't do that. This is just sort of a late PS3 game, and is another reason why I wish everything was on PC, but what are you gonna do? Regardless, for running on the machine as weak as it was, it looks pretty fantastic, and is definitely passable today. The only real complaint I have about Resistance 3 is sort of the same complaints I have about Half-Life 2 today. Since the game is a little bit more scripted, you'll be spending a decent amount of your time walking behind NPCs as they talk. And I know this is better than just watching a cutscene as it keeps you involved, but this kind of kills replay value. For example, if you go to play Half-Life 2 nowadays, how many times do you want to sit in Black Mesa East just waiting to go into Ravenholm? You'd rather just go into Ravenholm, right? You've heard this before. So for the first time you play Resistance 3, you'll probably not be bothered by this too much, but if you want to play it again and again, well, you're going to have to sit there and just kind of listen to him talk and follow an NPC rather than just playing the game. I still consider it a big improvement over the first two Resistance games, but, you know, not every game is perfect. Either way, I legitimately hated Resistance 1 and 2, and was very confused as to how it ended up getting good reviews, whereas I genuinely liked Resistance 3 and thought the reviews were accurate. Take that as you will. That sums up my video on Resistance 3. I streamed this entire game over to my Twitch, so if you were there, you could have hung out with me. If you still want to hang out with me, go give a follow to my Twitch. I stream there near every day. This is where I pull the footage from, so I like being able to talk to you guys. And if you want to help further, you can go check out my Patreon. There's some rewards over there. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.